Good afternoon, viewers. It's me, Javed Malik, welcoming you to another episode of the Ambassador Dialogue. Brexit has been dominating the headlines not only in Europe but around the world, and it's an important milestone also for Britain and how it re-engages with Europe in this new capacity and, of course, with the rest of the world, particularly the Commonwealth. To discuss this today, I've invited Charles Crawford, who's a former British ambassador, and we'll discuss with him about Brexit, how important it is, and what impact it will have on lives of the common man, but also the relationship Britain will have with the rest of the world. So welcome Charles Crawford to the program. I welcome you back after the break, and we will now talk about Brexit and how important it is not only for Britain, but also in Britain's relationship with Europe and, of course, the rest of the world, particularly the Commonwealth. And we are in conversation today with Mr. Charles Crawford, who's a former British ambassador and a speechwriter. And as you know, that Brexit has been dominating the headlines before COVID, and it's something that has engaged almost the entire British public, and if not the rest of the world. Why do you think Brexit was such an important milestone for Britain, which cost two prime ministers and perhaps an unending debate that lasted for so long? Finally, Britain came out of Europe, but what was the importance and why was it important for Britain to exit from Europe?
Well, this is a huge subject. And you can tackle it on many different levels. There is, if you like, my favorite is the philosophical level.
Yes.
And there's the political level, there's the economic level, there's the sort of popular level, there's the EU level, there's the international diplomacy level. I mean, you could have a podcast about each of these things, each of which lasts 3 years, talking about it. It's a big subject.
Yes.
I think, I'm after my career in diplomacy and my life, I suppose, I'm persuaded of one basic political truth, namely that there are two systems. One, do what I say. That's one system. And the other is the consent of the governed. This was the great triumph of the American Revolution, to come up with the idea of the consent of the government, And I think Brexit is basically the British people saying, thank you very much, we don't consent to this form of government. We've tried it, we've enjoyed it. And a lot of the young people in the UK were saying, but look at these horrible old people, look at them all voting against Brexit. But they were the old people were the ones who voted for EU membership 30, 40, 50 years ago, whenever it was.
Yes.
So there's an issue of consent. And I think this is a big thing, for non-Europeans to understand, is that the EU represents a philosophical experiment in sharing sovereignty and coming up with a new form of political organization, which has never been seen before in the world history. And it's so amazing, so remarkable that literally nowhere else in the world has decided to copy it. South Asia doesn't have anything like this. Latin America doesn't have anything like this. Africa doesn't have anything like this. Why? Because it involves a pooling of sovereignty, which many countries, in fact, the vast majority of countries in the world, think is too much.
They're not willing to
we've had a go at this, and we've said, thank you very much, it's too much.
So this is, of course, talking about sovereignty of nations and them sort of agreeing to impart with some of that sovereignty when they come into this European system. Britain, you rightly said that people who voted for this, if you want to call it an experiment, they fell in love with Europe and then they fell out of love with Europe, the older generation. But the younger people still felt that in terms of the future, especially the economic future of this region, you need to be part of a bloc rather than being an individual nation sitting in one corner. What would you say to those critics?
Well, it's simply not true. I mean, that's the big thing to say. I mean, most countries in the world are not in the EU. It may come as a surprise to certain British voters, but Pakistan, Australia, Canada, Brazil, Russia, China, Korea, they're not in the EU, Japan, yet somehow they seem to carry on, so there is a life outside this particular bloc. Now, I think one has to be careful in the rhetoric of this in distinguishing between opposing Europe and opposing the EU. They are different things. We're still part of Europe. We are where we are. We haven't floated off to the Pacific. we're going to carry on having a massive trading relationship with the rest of the European community and with other European countries. You know, it's a huge part of global economy is that relationship. That, all being well, is going to continue. Yeah. So the, you know, in all this, I think there's, once you get down to looking at the detail of it, what is the new relationship going to be? Is it going to be very different but looks pretty much the same? Or is it going to be pretty much the same and maybe looks very different? And that's the big battle going on over how exactly you want to have, what exactly is it you want? How different do you want it to be? Because there's obviously a cost in terms of breaking away from this amazing swamp of regulations and rules and requirements and standards and goodness knows what else. There's a cost to that. So how much value do you put upon the longer term opportunities, if you see it that way, of not being part of that? And there's a very technical, complex negotiation going on about precisely that.
Yes. Now, if you look at Brexit, and of course, like you said, it's the will of the people. People voted for it twice, once and then again in a referendum. And of course, you know, we had David Cameron, then we had Theresa May, and now we have, of course, Mr. Johnson, who is who led the Brexit. And of course, now we are in a stage where we're looking at post-Brexit. If it wasn't COVID, we would probably be looking more at post-Brexit, but now we're looking at post-COVID and post-Brexit. So if you look at Brexit for a moment and sort of, you know, put COVID on one side, how do you see this relationship between Europe and Britain evolving in their new role as they were an independent, well, Britain and the European Union? Prior to this, of course, it was Britain and France and Germany as individual nations, and now we are dealing with a bloc. So how would it be different?
Well, I think you've already seen a bit of a hint of that in the EU budget negotiations. The EU budget, partly because of the COVID, but they've had to have the first budget without us, and we put a lot of money into the pot. And so one of the things you've seen in this EU is an underlying tension between, if you like, ever more EU and enough EU. And so once we're out of the way, and we always said, well, we've got enough EU, we don't really want much more, but we kept getting more, and eventually we said, we don't want any more, goodbye. Yeah. Now you've seen EU taxes have been brought in. There's a moves to somehow pool the debt problem so that the poor German taxpayers are going to be more liable for Italian taxpayers and all the rest of it. So it looks as if the EU is going to try to be even more integrated than it was before, which means more centralized and frankly less democratic. And that is fine. I mean, we're just going to have to work out our relationship with that. I don't think there'll be an antagonistic relationship. And one of the things, I mean, actually a really good thing that's happened in the UK, one of the few good things that's happened this year, is that the Foreign Office and Development Ministry are being brought back together again under one roof. Yes. So you can imagine a world in which at the UN, for example, you know, Europe, instead of having one sort of rather messy voice like it had before, which was the UK and France, but sort of tied down by European need for consensus a lot of the time, even though we're permanent members, you can imagine a sense in which Europe now has two voices, two really distinct voices at the UN, but two distinct voices that work very closely together, and that ought to be fine. And if you link that to a much more agile British development policy, rather than a lot of development money having to go through the EU, you've got quite a powerful, in principle, quite a powerful new set of tools, I think, and nothing to be worried about.
That's an important point. And of course, if you were to look at it from a common man's perspective, you know, we talked about how Brexit was a result of the power of the people. You know, they wanted to move out. Now, at the end of the day, what would a common man be better off after Brexit in terms of his everyday life, economically, socially, in other words? How would it benefit him? Yes.
Well, that was where David Cameron parked his campaign. And there's a famous speech he gave just before the whole referendum campaign got going. He said, look, it's not about whether or not the UK would be a great country outside the EU. We'd be fine. The question is, would we be better off? That's the issue. And he campaigned on that issue. And within weeks, he was saying it's going to be like a plague of locusts and disaster and world war. And so he went from saying it's all going to be fine to it's all going to be disaster within a matter of days and just look ridiculous. So I think the answer is it may well be painful. There may be job losses. There may be food shortages for a while as we sort out all the queues of lorries coming from the continent. I mean, thousands of lorries full of stuff from all around the world and from Europe go backwards and forwards across the channel every day. That's a large part of global economic trade. So that has to be sorted out. But whether or not you're better off partly depends upon how much you value the freedom to consent to your own government. And that is a value separate from whether or not you have a job or not, and whether or not you have any money. And so we're going to see. I mean, I would just say my general feeling is it took us, 50 years or so to get really entangled with the EU. It may take us 30 or 40 years to establish something separate and, clearly better.
Yeah. And of course, it's an ideological question at the end of the day. And of course, Britain has a long history and of independence and being an important world power, and I'm sure that it will come out of it better off than it was with Europe. And let's hope for the best. As we're talking about the speeches, let's keep it on a hopeful note. But another point a lot of people and experts and observers have been raising is that Britain's future engagement with the rest of the world will be different, and one of the areas that it might focus on or might be advised to focus on is the Commonwealth, which is a legacy and a history with Britain and how people can relate to Britain around the world. Do you think re-engaging with the Commonwealth, especially economically, would be a good idea?
Well, I'm always a bit sort of struck by the fact that when we joined the EU, we had to really break a lot of relationships with Commonwealth countries, former parts of our sort of imperial space, because of EU rules. And if I were the Commonwealth, I would be slightly sort of annoyed that Britain is saying, well, we broke up with you 40 years ago, but here we are, everything's fine now, all back to normal. I mean, it's a little bit annoying. So I think Commonwealth countries are pretty tough and they need to think, okay, well, there may be opportunities for us. I think particularly in Africa, to be honest, if we could do something like liberalizing our trade with Africa, that would be like the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1848, whenever it was. I mean, that could be a massive, massive, massive gain for world trade if that could get going. But of course, the more we do that as bilaterally, the more we risk annoying our European partners who really love their common agricultural policy. So, it's all a bit of a balance. In general, I think we will do well to establish better, closer, more dynamic bilateral relationships than our EU membership allowed. That's for sure. And the joint foreign policy and development ministry should really help with that. But it's not about us saying, hello, we love you, therefore you have to love us. I mean, that's just not how it works. You've got to be, sensitive and have a certain humility, I think, in all this. But also this, again, coming back to tone, the sense of optimism.
Yes, and how effectively you communicate it is, of course, at the same time, a lot of Commonwealth nations do have that historical link with Britain, of course, would welcome that opportunity. Of course, there was a sort of a temporary love affair with Europe, but I'm sure it will, on a long-lasting way, where the European Union can continue in its own space, and Britain can, of course, flourish and also rekindle the relationship with the Commonwealth. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Charles Crawford, for joining us today. And we talked not only about effective communications, but also about Brexit and how it will impact on us as common people, and of course, the relations Britain will have with the rest of the world. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you again.
The Ambassador Partnership. Access, Engagement, Resolution.